Welcome to our introduction to Christian missions. We are going to address a different subject today. We will be seeing traditional religions, primal religiosity, and mission dynamics. But we want to start our class by introducing some definitions. The term traditional religions does not intend to mean old or obsolete in no ways. Basically, what it means is something that is native or part of the fabric of the culture of the people. All of us have traditions, and the Africans the same way, and even those from the majority world. The issue of definitions has been always a challenge for sociologists, anthropologists, and even missiologists. When Westerners did not fully comprehend the religious phenomenon among the people of other cultures, they easily coined them as animistic or primal. And I don't take this loosely because there was an analysis and trying to figure out how things are, but they could not fit into the worldview of those studying those cultures. In some cases, simply, it was called fetish. It doesn't just add up to what we understand by true religion. I prefer to designate the religious experience or expressions of the African people as a traditional religion, as it has all the ingredients of religious expression of a people in a distinct culture. Well, missionary workers did not always really start there and trying to evaluate to what the culture looks like. Why? Because they come from a two-tiered world. They came from a two-dimensional worldview, and they understand the physical world. They also understand the supernatural world. The spirit world of the African people or peoples from the majority world was missed altogether, was just left out completely. And that is why it's important for us to study this topic as we think about those traditional religions, because it helps us to make a contrast between our cosmic culture and the culture in which we are trying to serve. So I want to make here a distinction between the primitive and the primal religion. The term primal religion was introduced as an alternative to the term primitive religion, which was widely used in academic circles. Usually they'll call them primitive just because they did not excel to the level of their understanding of civilization of the day. Long before this use of primitive and primal, we need to understand that long way an English anthropologist, Edward Tyler, through his publication in late 19th century, he had already addressed and coined the religious phenomenon in a different way. Not all academicians, however, prefer to use such terms as primary, primitive, or primal. They would rather use terms such as pre-literate or basic or indigenous. Others even use such terms as folk religions or traditional religions. Now, in 1871, Tyler published Primitive Culture, which made him the originator of cultural anthropology. It is worth noting that he was an evolutionist. I'm not talking here of a missiologist or a religious guru. He's somebody who has different nuances and perspectives to analyzing religion. He brought to a wider use the term animism. Tyler considered animism as a minimum definition of religion and asserted that all religions, from the simplest to the most complex, involve some form of animism. Well, Webster defines this term animism as an attribution of conscious life to objects in and phenomena of nature or to inanimate objects. So that's kind of the definition we're having there, which is quite different from what we could use in defining a religion. Now, because of cultural differences, we come up with what we'll call the clash of systems. The encounter between the Western missionaries and the nationals or the native people in the majority world, and in this case, talking of Africa, sub Sahara, really had their challenging times. Missionaries were influenced by their own cultures, while the nationals were struggling for their identity amidst colonial powers' influences and a rapidly modernizing and changing world. Actually, Keith Eitel notes that it was during the time when the colonial empires were breaking up that most African traditional systems were in the midst of full encounter with the challenges of modernity and the Christian gospel brought by the Western missionaries. As you can see, there's here struggle for identity. There's a struggle for self assertion, understanding who we are in light of all that is happening with colonial powers and now with the religious influences. So, this takes us to talk a little bit about the struggles for identity. You will understand that in the 50s and all the way to the 80s, there was much search for independence from colonial powers. Thus, you have the Revolutionary Wars, and you may say, why am I talking about the Revolutionary Wars? It's because during that moment of changes in the colonial powers, Christianity was also coming up and sometimes confused as the other hand of the colonial power. And so this was bringing disturbances among the people that missionaries were trying to communicate the gospel. So there was a struggle with the new gospel message, considering or in light of the African traditional social values. This is one thing that we have always known, and now we are having this how to make sense out of that. It was not always easy to really connect the dots, yet missionaries have to do their work. And we will talk about missionary endeavors and paternalism in a moment. And it's really kind of, it arose other issues in the early 70s, which is called moratorium. And I'll mention this just in a moment. Well, when the gospel was being brought to Africa and also other majority world cultures, we need to understand that it came sometimes closed in Western ecclesial forms. By that I mean, what was known in the country of origin of the missionary is what the missionary took to the other culture, and without sometimes much analysis of the cultural forms or religious forms of that culture, which made it difficult. So, gospel message being framed in the Western culture would bring some difficulties to be well received by the people in the new culture. So, Western missionaries had to wrestle with this contrast between what they brought and what the people had as their heritage and beliefs. So the missionary has to actually have a comparative analysis of what he knew and what he is now getting to know in the new culture if he were to be successful. So that situation brought a few conflicts for two reasons. Sometimes there was an attitude of paternalism and attitude of ethnocentrism. But paternalism is that attitude whereby the missionary seems to be always in charge and always the dad, the one who is taking lead, and the local people are just kind of receiving the recipe that's already made. And that has not always been the most appropriate way to convey the gospel or lead the church. By ethnocentrism, I am seeing here that attitude in which the missionary will put himself in a higher position than the local people. Whatever is from the West is always going to be the best, and not necessarily to lay low than the local thing. It's not a matter of being high or low, but it's a matter of understanding, are they connecting point or things that can be relevant instead of emulating only those things from my own culture. So all those approaches and attitude actually um, called for what was called then moratorium. By moratorium, Africans gathered together. They decided that they should warn the missionary agencies to put on hold any sending of new missionaries or even their resources. And in some cases, they really called for missionaries that already were in the countries, in the African context, to pack and go home. Well, we know that everybody was kind of unanimously agreeing with that, but it was never completely implemented because it's not the best solution anyway. We still need to maintain partnerships, but they have to be healthy partnerships. It's not one over the other, but that together we can do something relevant in the context. And one of the problems that Western thinkers have shown is what Possew notes or observes, that Western theologians have given the impression that they have a monopoly of God, the gospel, and the way of constructing theology, which really goes against any principles of contextualization if you are to become relevant in proclaiming the gospel. So I need us to understand this. As you think of going into the mission field or understand the missionary dynamics, you need to learn about the nature of traditional religions. And we know that both sociologists and anthropologists have struggled to find appropriate nomenclature to the religious phenomenon in the African culture. And certainly that can be said of other countries in the majority world. Such terms as animism or primal religion have been used. I would prefer, however, to use the term traditional religion when I refer to the African context. It is imperative, however, that missionaries understand the spiritual world of the recipient culture. And here are a few considerations that a missionary or a Christian worker needs to take into account when going to a different culture. They need to understand the basic characteristics of traditional religions. One of those elements is the concept of a supreme being, God. Are we talking the same language when we talk about supreme being, about God? Well, for Christians, we understand that our God is personal. We can relate to him, but not so in the African traditional religions. They believe that God is far removed from the people. So the only way they can connect with God is through other emissaries, which include what they call the living dead, the ancestral spirits, and other spirits in the community. So the essence of being in communication with God is not in the same way that is understood by evangelicals like you and I, who study the Bible and have theology. So we need to understand even about the essence of a person is different. A person does not exist in isolation in African culture. He belongs to a community, is part of the community, and his reality and his being is emulated by the community as a whole. So we don't talk much about I as much as we talk about us. And the former president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, will say ujamaa, which brings again the idea of community. We are together. So another issue that's important to understand when you think about traditional religion is about communications with deities. They are what they call personalized dead, who are the ancestors, those family members who have deceased, but yet they are said never to have died. They can still have communication with them, and when they have issues, they can go to them. The thing is, they can manipulate them, they can do some ceremonies and appease the spirits and get their way on. But there are also the impersonalized dead, which are the spirits, and those are part of the whole medium way of communicating with the deities. Now, we need to see about the mission's dynamics. Missionaries enter other cultures with accustomed Western cultural assumptions. They have a set of understanding that set of assumptions that in the way how they understand religion, Christianity. But when they come to a new culture, they have to understand that they cannot assume too much. They have to understand that they come from a two-tiered world view. They understand that there is a physical and a spiritual world, and they forget completely what Paul Hibbert, a missiologist and anthropologist, called in his article published in 1982, titled The Flaw of the Excluded Middle. Here he was saying Western missionaries, they need to look something that is missing between the physical and the spiritual. And that is the spiritual world where the demons, the ancestral spirits, and the other spirits are in action, believed to be the ones that can commune with the living beings. So missionaries sometimes don't understand that, and I'm glad Hubert did that on that article, which I recommend for you to read, The Flaw of the Excluded Middle. Missionaries need to understand the spirit world of the people they are trying to reach with the gospel message, and they need to avoid to quickly make judgments of other cultures based on their Western lenses or assumptions. So here are some of the things we need to do when you are trying to communicate the gospel in or among the traditionalists. Gospel communication should penetrate these levels. We need to address the behavior of the people. That's what is easily spotted. We can easily see that. But we also need to address their values and their beliefs and their core worldview. We need to ask the question, why do people do what they do? Why do they act the way how they do? And all those things are embedded in understanding mainly the worldview of the people, which dictates the rest of their beliefs and values and behaviors. So that's very important to understand. One other dimension of understanding among traditional religions, especially in Africa, is about the concept of time. While in the West, there is a defined past, present, and future, not so in the African context. Time is seen as here and now, moving toward the realm of the ancestors. That's how the African traditionalists or the former adherents of African traditional religions will see time like. Actually, John Beatty, an African theologian, he made this observation. For African people, traditionalists as they may be called, time is simply a composition of events which have occurred, those which are taking place now and those which are inevitably or immediately to occur. That is what constitutes the time. What has not taken place, or what has no likelihood of an immediate occurrence, falls into the category of not time. What is certain to occur, or what falls within the rhythm of natural phenomena, is in the category of inevitable or potential time. The most significant consequence of this is that, according to traditional concepts, time is a two-dimensional phenomenon which, with a lost past and a present and virtual no future. That will be very difficult for a Western person to understand. So you need to see that. So there is a need of proper contextualization. If we are to communicate the gospel in that African traditional context, we have to define well our approach in such a way that we are making the gospel relevant to those we are trying to reach. So, there are two warnings here. Number one, excessive contextualization results in a syncretistic church, which we don't want. We don't want a church that people are, in one hand, doing church, on the other hand, doing their tradition, and blending those two things together. That is called syncretism. We don't want that. But lack of contextualization, on the other hand, reflects an imported church, hence irrelevant to the people in the new culture, or even people that we are trying to reach with the gospel. So the missionary or the Christian worker needs to learn the culture of the people and find points of connection that will help people grasp and embrace the gospel message, and not viewing it as an imported religion. So people have called Christianity the religion of the Westerners, and the Bible is the book of the Westerners. Why? Because they saw some kind of connection between the colonial powers and missionaries, and we need to really wipe out that idea by trying to connect with people in their personal level, finding the right forms and categories in the culture that are relevant to the communication of the gospel. So this is what I think is important for us to do. Now, some of us will say, but the churches are mushrooming in Africa. And we know that according to the World Christian Database of 2018, they make this breakdown of Christian population. And Africa is said to be in a position of 631 million Christians. And this makes Africa to be really above Latin America by 30 million. But now, what is happening with all this mushrooming? We need to understand that that is not just about the mainstream churches, but we have the mainstream churches, and we have the neo-Pentecostal groups, and we also have the African independent churches, or also called African initiated churches, which by evangelical standards, when you evaluate them, you might put them in the level of cults. And yet, they have deserted from the mainstream churches and in search of a more relevant way of doing church, which connects with the culture of the people. And it's our task as missionaries to think, how can we really present the gospel that will connect with the people? And since I've just said earlier, we need to come to a point where we realize that our assumptions are not always true to the reality of the people, so we need to study the culture. We should not be hastening to multiply the churches before we even understand how to connect with the people. Because otherwise, we will do that and we will have a Western church, or when we try to use traditional forms without proper analysis, we may end up really with a more syncretistic church, as I mentioned earlier on. Now, as I conclude, I want us to understand this, that the struggle with syncretism in Africa is yet to be over. Many people are still going to church, and when they have their issues and problems, they go to the witch doctors and they consult those and they try to appease the spirits of their ancestors. And why are we not transitioning there? Regardless of all this growth of church in Africa, I want to submit that the church in the African ecclesial context is still struggling with appropriate disciple making processes that engage the worldview of those who were former adherents of African traditional religions. So Africa still wrestles with that issue. So we need to have a proper discipleship taking place, and we also need to have an appropriate leadership development. So those really are the two aspects in Africa that are still holding the church down and not having us be a church that is flourishing with its full strength. Actually, some have mentioned that the church in Africa is miles wide and an inch deep. The reason is we have those two problems: a discipleship that is not engaging the worldview of the people, and the lack of proper development of leadership that are really understanding the biblical worldview to the point that they can transfer that to their own people and help them grow in their faith in ways that they are able to embrace true Christianity. So I want to close our time today saying that we need to continue committed to the Great Commission and not the Great Omission. We need to move on, preach the gospel, but we need to do it in relevant terms that will penetrate the culture of those people we want to serve, and we're going to be able to see a church growing in a more sustainable way, in a more biblical based church. That's what we need as missionaries and church um, planters. We need to see a church that is well immersed in the scriptures. So, our commitment to Great Commission and our desire to be culturally relevant should never undermine our desire and eagerness to be true to the biblical proclamation and taking the message of the gospel that is not closed with other cultural traditions and forms, but the pure gospel preached in a given culture in a way that is going to bring transformation, change that is needed for a healthy church. So I want to leave you with this thought as we move on, that just think about how are you acting even in the country where you are, where you grew up. Do you understand your behaviors, your values, your beliefs, and your worldview? If you do, understand that other cultures have theirs. So when you get there, you need to be able to learn those so that you are able to penetrate in those cultures in ways that are relevant, that are going to be helpful, and they will bring up a church that is solid and well established in the scripture. And not only that, but being well established in the scripture is able to transfer a message that is appropriate, that is well established, but also relevant to the culture of the people. May God bless us and let us continue committed to the Great Commission and taking the gospel here home and also to the utmost part of the world.